My grandmother was the hippest woman alive. She would have fit in at the coolest cocktail bar in any town. Her drink of choice was the Whisky Highball, which is having its heyday right now. Oh, but not any whiskey would do. There was only one, and it had to be Dewar's. As you can imagine, my guest today loved that story. Why? Because he is Global Brand Ambassador. I'm Susan Schwartz, your drinking companion, and this is Lush Life Podcast. Every week, we are inspired to live life one cocktail at a time. Needless to say, Fraser Campbell holds my grandmother in high regard, as well as every other Dewar's whiskey drinker. He's on a mission to bring people into whiskey while they're having fun. Who doesn't want to head down to the beach with some whiskey piña coladas right now? I know I do. How Fraser is completing his mission can be found on today's program. But before that, I wanted to tell you about an event that is coming up to benefit the Drinks Trust, which has provided care and support to the drinks industry since 1886. On Tuesday, December 1st from 6 to 7:30 UK time on Zoom, they're having a holiday cocktail party run by David Wood from Liana Cocktail Company. Their interactive cocktail experience contains 3 handmade classic cocktails using exceptional spirit producers from around the world. You can find out more on alushlifemanual.com. Now, on to Fraser. I am so excited to have you on the show because my grandmother's favorite cocktail was a Dewar's and soda. Literally, that's all she ordered. I remember that. So to have the global brand ambassador of Dewar's on my show is like, I know she's either watching me from above or below, which I'm sure they're having a lot more fun down there. And she is just so thrilled right now at this moment. So thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Susan. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. And obviously, needless to say, your grandmother had amazing taste in whiskey and drinks.
Yes, she did. Now, we always start at the beginning. So I want to know everything about you.
Yes, how I fell into whiskey ultimately. So I grew up in Speyside in the northeast of Scotland. And basically, in a roundabout way, I started working in bars when I was 18 years old to try and keep me out of trouble, which I think in the long term didn't really work out. It definitely got me into more trouble in good ways, obviously. But I was working in a pub in my hometown of Forres, which is, next to some amazing distilleries, places like, Ben Romick, Dallas Dew Distillery, Craigellachie, which is one of our distilleries at John Dewar and Sons. And over the years, when I started studying, I still kept bartending on the side and kind of leaned towards that more than actually going to classes. I did get a degree in the end in English and film studies, but I definitely sort of stuck with bars and hospitality. So I ended up doing that for the next sort of 15 years, taking me to, running some amazing bars in Edinburgh, then moving out
wait. You're going way too quickly. Now, okay. Did you always were thinking bars? What else was on the horizon? Did you grow up drinking, whiskey, all that stuff?
Yeah, look, I mean, growing up in Speyside, being surrounded by, like 30 to 40 different distilleries, it's inevitable that at a very young age, you can have various encounters, with one of our finest exports. So I went to my first distillery when I was about 7 years old. I very distinctly remember the smell of the washback when I stuck my head in and got my head blown off by the CO2 emissions. What
was that? You were going to a distillery when you were...
Yeah. You can go around a distillery at any age, really. I've taken my nephew around who's 4 years old, to see how the whiskey's made throughout fermentation and distillation. So when we get to the fermentation stage of making whiskey, that's where a lot of these flavors and esters start getting created for the first time. And obviously, when you've got barley, mixed with sugar and water, and obviously you start getting fermentation, CO2 is a large emission. When you stick your head into the washbacks where we do the fermentation, you really get a sense of it. So I did that when I was about 7 years old. And that obviously stuck with me for a very long time. I can still remember that sensation and that smell today. But obviously my first proper encounter with whiskey many years later, when I, of course, was of legal drinking age, my first experience with whiskey probably wasn't the best one, and I think like a lot of people, sadly, like when you encounter Scotch or whiskey for the first time, if your experience is not a good one, that experience might stay with you and unfortunately sort of tarnish that notion of coming back to whiskey. So it actually took me a long time to fall in love with Scotch whiskey, believe it or not. I sort of had to travel to the ends of the earth to basically get homesick enough that having a whiskey would take me back to Scotland.
Well, why was your first experience with whiskey bad, other than falling in it?
I think I think we've all had that experience when we're younger, whether it's whiskey, tequila, gin, rum, vodka. It doesn't matter what it is, but if your first experience is basically hugging a toilet for the next 12 hours, naturally, you're not going to really fall in love with that spirit. And also at a very young age as well, like your mouth and your taste buds, your sense of smell is not equipped to deal with something like that. It takes years of practicing to appreciate that, to really enjoy it. And so, like a lot of people, they treat whiskey as a shot or a shooter when they're younger, like when they're at university. And people actually sort of bypass the best part of the whiskey, which is the aromas and the flavors, and just use it as a mechanism for having an amazing time, or in some cases, not so much the next day. So, a large part of what I do now is, as global ambassador for Dewar, is showing people how to appreciate whiskey and enjoy it for the first time in a lot of different ways, whether that's neat or in a cocktail, or, in the case of your grandmother, having a whiskey and soda, or a highball, as we call it, for the first time, and helping them fall in love with whiskey.
Yes, we will definitely get to all of that and what you do at Dewar's. But back to you. So why do you think bartending took you away from any of the studies that you were doing? What was it about it that really drew you in and wanted you to pursue it as a career?
I think I've probably always naturally sort of had an affinity just towards socializing and hanging out with people. And I think, bartending was just basically a way of doing that and getting paid for it. So you were basically on the side of studying, you had the time to go in the evenings and, be in the bar and be in that environment and actually, making money from it. So why wouldn't you do it, right? And then obviously at that time when I started bartending, sort of circa, 2000, I had no aspirations to do it as a long-term career, because at that time, this industry as we know it now didn't really exist. Like it was all just bubbling. It was just starting to get going with bars like Milk and Honey opening in New York and the cocktail making a comeback, the internet obviously playing a massive part in all that too. So I just bartended because I enjoyed it. And I never, while I was studying, thought this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my days. But obviously, I think the great thing about bartending is you can sort of take it with you anywhere. And when you move to a new city, which I've done quite a lot in the past 20 years, it's such a good way just to get into the community and meet people, whether it's other bartenders or, the regulars that come in.
And is that what you thought when you started? Oh, okay, I'm bartending now, but I want to go someplace else and travel, and I'm going to work there while I travel?
Yeah, I think when I was in Aberdeen, I definitely had a yen to go to Australia at some stage. I think I'd met quite a few Australians when I was working there, and we definitely got on. I think their sort of passion for socializing and alcohol was probably pretty similar to the Scots in that sense. So I struck a chord with some Aussies, and I ended up going, several years later. But in between that, the key thing for me, I think, was moving to Edinburgh, because I moved to Edinburgh when I finished uni, to then start looking for jobs. Like obviously at that stage, I was still sort of being pressured by my mom, as I imagine many people in the industry have been, to say, when are you going to get a real job? That question, which we all love to hear. Or what is it you actually do? What are you studying? I was always big into cinema and film, and I always envisioned that's where I'd sort of end up, which never transpired. But luckily, nowadays in the wonderful world we exist in, you can do lots of cool video projects. So I think in a roundabout way, you can still draw that passion in. But no, I was applying for all manner of jobs. When I moved to Edinburgh, I was like sales jobs and, just anything with a salary. And then I was working in a really fun little cocktail bar called Candy Bar in Edinburgh, which was basically a party bar, and we were making French martinis, raspberry mojitos, B-52s. Like this is very much off the back of the 90s bartending scene. But it was so much fun, and just meeting everyone, and the first time really getting a sense of this bar community, this like town full of bartenders where everyone knows each other, cocktail competitions, like getting involved in those, and just really vibing off other people, and the passion and the creativity was there. So it's just like, this is kind of fun. And I think, again, like I hadn't thought this is what I'm going to do. But when I then started traveling after, a couple of years in Edinburgh, I went to Australia. Again, very easy to take with you. You land, you get a bar job. And again, just getting into the scene, it's such a good way to integrate yourself quickly.
Was it a one-way ticket to Australia?
Well, the first one wasn't, but yeah, the second one was. I went out for a wedding. I met some amazing Aussies when I was working in Edinburgh. I was working with one of them actually, and made friends with them, and they invited me out to their wedding. So I said, why the hell not? This is the way to do it. So I booked a year's working visa, flew down to Sydney, worked there for 6 months in a couple of different bars. And then I moved down to Melbourne for the remaining 6 months, which is there. I totally fell in love with Melbourne. I don't know what it was, but it was like amazing coffee and restaurants and bars, like laneway culture. Like Melbourne, I totally fell in love. So after 6 months, you had to go back home because my visa was up, but I got back to Scotland feeling there's something unfinished business. I don't know if maybe is the right term, but I had to go back and find out. So I basically just worked for 4 months and managed to secure a second visa to go back. And I then stayed for another 4 years.
And I think you're minimizing what you did while you were there, because you came up with this brilliant idea for the Global Bartender Exchange.
Yeah. So I think when I landed in Sydney, I probably, you find yourself trying to figure out where all the cool bars are, and obviously you might know someone who can give you a few recommendations to like drop off CVs, and you're like running around the city. And obviously it's a great way to get to know the place by going into all the bars to do that. I think when I was in Melbourne, when I came back the second time, I was running a cocktail bar called The Alchemist in Fitzroy, which is this kind of cool little hipster kind of neighborhood. Some really cool bars there, like Black Pearl. So I was running this cocktail bar, and I think maybe like a year and a half in, like one weekend, I don't know what happened, but we had like no bartenders. There was like sudden drought, and I kind of reached out to a few people, and it was almost like there was just a lack of really good bartenders around at that time. Everyone was sort of feeling the same way. So I just basically created a Facebook group called the Melbourne Bartender Exchange, added like, a couple of hundred of people I'd met in Melbourne, all the bar managers and bartenders and brand ambassadors, and just said, look, hey guys, I know everyone's sort of struggling for finding staff to work at weekends. So if anyone lands in the city, or, of anyone, just put it on the page here and we can use it and as a little resource. And then sure enough, people started using the page more frequently. It became a sort of a source of banter. People putting up bartender memes, people complaining about the price of limes, arguing about how to garnish an old fashioned. Is it a cherry? Is it not a cherry? So,
Peeking out, right? Cocktail peeking.
Yeah. And obviously like that hasn't changed. I mean, even before Facebook, we were using bartender forums, the proper old school internet bartender forums, like Create Topic, and threads and all that kind of stuff. So I think Facebook, like using the groups, was just a way to get everyone online and create this little hub. And it grew really quickly. It was like, a couple hundred members, then it was 1,000, then it was 5,000. And it, like, the reason the group was getting so big was because people were landing from overseas trying to find work and coming on the group to find jobs.
And it was global, I assume. This is global.
Well, it wasn't at that stage. We had the Melbourne page, but then I was working with one of my best friends, Hannah Curl, who worked with me in The Alchemist. And then we had this idea to take this idea and actually turn it into a global network of different bartender exchanges in different cities. So I think one day we just kind of did it. We just set up like 200 different Facebook groups in different cities around the world. And sort of, in some cities we knew people already who would be really good to sort of help run the groups, like in a sort of admin's, capacity. So we did that quite quickly. And some of the groups grew really fast and really quick, and some of them didn't. But, it was like, we connected to like London and Edinburgh and Dublin and like the US and New Zealand. And it suddenly became this thing where you could basically use the groups to sort of find your next move. Or if you knew you were moving to, from Melbourne to Auckland, you could use it to line up your next job or a place to live in advance. So yeah, the groups grew. We ended up having, I think, about 150,000 members in total in all the groups.
That's a full-time job.
It was actually a full-time. And we also invested in it as well. Like we took some money and we tried to build like an app, which didn't really work out the way we planned. The first one we launched was terrible and didn't work properly, and the design wasn't great. So we redesigned it and we relaunched it, and it was a very expensive learning lesson. But we were so invested in, like when you have an idea and you fully believe in it, you're just like, yeah, look, I don't care. I'm just going to go nuts and go all in. So yeah, that kind of started in 2011. Yeah, so that's 9 years ago. I mean, a lot of the groups are still going guns. I mean, the Melbourne page has now 70,000 members.
I would imagine it would be hard to be seen. Like you come in and say, "Hi, I'm new here," and it's hard to get to the top.
It was a bit like it's like babysitting online several thousand bartenders who've sometimes like knocked off a shift and had a few drinks and decide they want to have a bit of a debate online. And sometimes actually, like, the groups would get out of control quite quickly. There'd be a lot of threads and like, all sorts of stuff happening. But, we sort of tried our best to keep the forums fair and objective and kick out people who were being out of line about any topics.
And were you getting, I know you're probably going to be modest about this, but were you getting more and more known as the person who put this together, or the two of you and your friend Hannah? Like, did people recognize that it was you who started it all?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely were like the face. I mean, it was only really the two of us initially, and then we had some amazing people come on board to help us run the groups. Because basically at one stage, me and Hannah both left Australia, so I'd moved to Barcelona and Hannah had moved to China, and so we needed someone on the ground to help us sort of run things and have someone who was really well known. So we actually had in Melbourne, we had Alex Ross, who's the sister of Sam Ross, who created the penicillin. Alex was running the Melbourne group for us for many years, and she was great and did an amazing job. She was well known and loved in the scene. So we kind of had that strategy with the different groups, because it was so much work. We had to find people who could help us to run the different pages in the different cities. So, but yeah, I mean, of course, like we had a central Facebook group, which we used for the sort of central discussions. And, when we kicked it off, we sort of purposefully, invited some big hitters in the industry to help sort of get the conversations going and things like that. So yeah, look, I think that doing it didn't really work out the way I planned, and it definitely blew up, much larger than I think we thought it was going to get. But, investing in that website and everything else is like, it may have paid off at the time, and it might not have worked the way we wanted to, but it kind of creates a stepping stone to the next thing you're going to do. And
I heard you say Barcelona.
Yeah.
So when did you think it was time to leave Australia?
Well, I didn't really decide. I think the Department of Immigration decided it was my time to leave.
No.
So, I mean, 4.5 years or 5 years was a pretty good time. And I'll always have very fond memories of being in Melbourne and Australia, but it was definitely my time to leave, despite my trying to stay as much as possible. So, obviously not wanting to go straight back to the UK, took a little stop off in Spain for about 2.5 years to Barcelona.
And what was it like there after being in Melbourne?
It was great. I mean, it was so different, but obviously I think for me personally, I don't know if I was born in the wrong country, but I obviously like the warm weather. So that was definitely a bonus. Barcelona is amazing. Like, it's such, a beautiful city. It's got all the culture, all the Gaudi art, the architecture. It's also insanely cheap to live there as well. My rent was like 150 euros a month, which is basically nothing. So you could basically you could work a lot less, I found, in Barcelona. You could work, 2 or 3 nights a week and subsidize your living quite well, and just have a really sort of good quality of life. Like, had loads of time to go down to the beach, or I was also doing, as well as running the GB, doing graphic design and a few other little bits and pieces as well, having time to play guitar and all that kind of stuff. So Barcelona was almost a bit like, taking a step back and having a bit of break, because I was obviously running cocktail bars. So when I got to Barcelona, I just went back to bartending just to enjoy, not running a bar, because I think having the responsibility of doing all that stuff online, I just wanted to have a job where I didn't have as much responsibility, just to have a bit of a break.
Was it a little bit more mellow, like your punters, but did they drink different kinds of things? Were you exploring different ingredients while you were there? Did you see a difference?
I think Spanish people, well, Catalan people as well, bearing in mind there's 2 cultures there in Barcelona, the drinking culture was much simpler. I think Melbourne was way more advanced in terms of the cocktail scene, and I think Barcelona was very much still about like things like mojitos and caipirinhas, and like there's obviously like the beach there as well, So, but certain drinks I came across, like, which I fell in love with, which I might not have seen elsewhere, like the michelada, for example. I'd never really encountered the michelada in Melbourne or anywhere else. When I got to Barcelona, on a Sunday, that's all people drank. Like, I used to work in this really cool little cocktail bar called Betty Ford's, which did like burgers and cocktails. And on a Sunday, people would come down for a burger and a michelada. And like, I was just like, this drink is great. It's literally just a Bloody Mary with beer, but it's so good. And that's something I hadn't really seen popularized elsewhere. The gin and tonic was obviously massive at the time as well. The whole, crazy, 17 garnishes in your gin and tonic was really taking off. And the thing in Barcelona is like, people there love to drink and they love to party, but everyone's so chilled. Like, I think you get a lot in Europe, versus places like the UK or, Australia. Like, people tend to drink, but they can hold their drink. Like, you don't see them like passing out in the street.
Right.
You know what I mean? They just have have a very good like relationship with alcohol.
Old world drinking as opposed to new world drinking.
And also, it could be to do with the fact that they don't have dinner till like 10 o'clock at night, so they probably they go out, eat later, so their stomach's still full. So when they're drinking, they can hold their drink. Whereas I think what happens in the UK is people knock off from work at 5 and go straight to the pub, skip dinner, and
that's true. I forgot England is old world, right?
Drunk by 10 o'clock. Yeah.
So you're in Spain. When did Dewar's come calling?
Oh, so yeah, about 2.5 years into Barcelona, I got a message one day of Jacob Bryars, who is our head of global advocacy at Bacardi, who I'd known for probably about 10 years before that. He dropped me a message one day, saying, look, we're on the lookout for a new global ambassador for Dewar's. You happen to be Scottish, you like a whiskey. Obviously, I'd repaired my relationship with whiskey by this stage.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Repairing relationship.
Yeah. I mean, that obviously happened in Australia. Used to go to some amazing whiskey bars after work, like Whiskey and Ailment, and I think it was called Chez Regine at the time, and have like a beer and a whiskey after work. So that's where the repairing of that relationship happened. So by the time I got to Spain, that was fine. So Jacob messaged going, we're looking for a new global ambassador, travel the world talking about Dewar's. And it's quite funny because I'd been approached about a few ambassador roles before, and I'd kind of like, thought, I don't really keen to do it, and I think when the Dewar's role came up, I didn't know a lot about Dewar's, despite growing up in Scotland, because historically Dewar's was more present in export countries like Latin America and the US. But I had actually worked with it in Australia. When I was running The Alchemist, it was actually in our speed rail. It was our house pour whiskey. So I'd worked with it a lot and made a lot of drinks with it. So I knew the flavor. I just hadn't looked at the backstory. And when I started researching and reading into the history of Dewar's, I was totally blown away by all these stories of Tommy Dewar and how the brand came to be a globally iconic Scotch whiskey brand. So naturally, it took me less than, a few minutes to make my mind up about taking the role.
Now, since you brought him up, everything I read about you says that you're a 21st century Tommy Dewar. And so what is a little bit of the history and why did you fall in love with that?
So, I mean, obviously, if you look at all the sort of major, Scotch whiskey brands, everyone started off in very similar circumstances, which is that, there's probably a shop where the original founder had set up, was selling whiskeys and wines and spirits, tea and other stuff as well. It was either going to be a wine and spirit merchant or a grocer. And so I think the John Dewar story, he very much was like a family man. He was passionate about Scotch and really pushed it and made a really good name for himself in Scotland. But I think Tommy Dewar is the really interesting sort of character in the story because he was the sort of youngest of 10 children who came on board and took Dewar's around the world. Like he was like the first global ambassador as well. He traveled the world for 2 years nonstop, going to 26 different countries, popularizing Dewar's everywhere he went. He had an amazing relationship with the media. So whenever something came up, for example, we actually pioneered the highball, like the actual drink. Tommy Dewar pioneered that term. So, yeah.
I had no idea. No.
Yeah. So like when Tommy Dewar was on his travels, he stopped in New York for, he was out in New York one night with some friends. They went to a bar and he ordered some balls of whiskey, because ball was an old sort of Irish term for a glass of whiskey, a ball of malt. So he said, can we get some balls of whiskey? And then when the bartender turned up and he looked at the glasses, he actually went, well, let's put some soda and ice in there and put in a tall glass and we'll have a highball. Because at that time, the whiskey and soda was really taking off because, in the early 1800s, people were drinking cognac or brandy and soda. But when phylloxera happened and, pretty much took cognac and grape spirits off the map, Scotch, which was massively taking off from the sort of 1860s onwards, really sort of stepped in. So Tommy decided to pioneer this drink, this term highball, as a means of, enjoying whiskey and soda together. So that's obviously been a story which had a lot of fun with over the past few years, bringing that to life. And so obviously using my my bartender background, a large part of what I do is developing different highballs for each of our whiskeys that we have, and obviously doing different events and showcasing the highball as a really great way for people to start off on their whiskey journey, or enjoy the whiskey in different ways with different flavors.
So I have to thank Tommy, I guess, because my grandmother would probably not be drinking it had he not come over, created a highball. She didn't even know she was drinking a highball, but she was, and thus whiskey and soda, Dewar's and soda. There we go. Yeah. So you brought up what you're doing as a global brand ambassador going around the world. Have you had any surprises where people have been drinking Dewar's in a way that you had no idea that they would drink it, or different cocktails that you thought, oh my God, why, I wish I had thought of that?
I think one of my standout memories, I mean, I wasn't surprised about this. In fact, I actually asked for the drink, but one of my favorite memories was I was traveling around Latin America, because places like Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic are really popular markets for Dewars. So when I was there, one of my first trips, I'd been down at the beach. We'd been touring around, I'd been sort of jumping into different bars to make, different, I was doing whiskey piña coladas and things like that. And people were like, what? And then one of the bars we stopped at, towards the end, I said, look, I just want to have a whiskey and a Dewars and coconut water. So the bartender, she basically went, no problem. So she went and got like a whole coconut and then pulled out a machete, at which point I was like, I feel like I'm back in Glasgow or something like this. And she held the coconut, sort of spinning it in the palm of her hand while chopping the lid, and, very, very cleanly just pulled the lid off. She poured out some of the coconut water, put in loads of ice and a massive, pouring of Dewars 12, and just handed me the coconut. And honestly, in that point in time, I was like, this is perfection, because it was like, super hot. It was like 40 degrees. I was down at the beach and I just had this coconut filled with whiskey and coconut water and ice. And I was like, this is beautiful. So when we launched our Dewars rum cask Caribbean Smooth, which is our 8-year-old blend finished in Caribbean rum casks last year, I thought this is the drink I want to bring to life with the whiskey. So I played around with it and, just thought, well, this is very simple. Do, double measure of Caribbean Smooth with some coconut water and ice, done. But for some reason, when, I gave it to some people, I found that like people were very sort of split on coconut water as a way to enjoy whiskey. And like in Latin America, it's huge. Like people love it. And maybe it is sort of endemic to that sort of particular country and your personal preferences. So, getting this feedback, I was like, okay, well, I need to keep the coconut flavor, but sort of, make it maybe stick to what Tommy Dewar originally did, which is having that fizz and that effervescence, which actually makes it a highball. Highball is effectively spirit with like a fizzy mixer. So I thought, right, well, I'll take the soda, and then to get the coconut flavor, I'll just use some concentrated coconut syrup. So use the Monin syrup, and then obviously some lemon juice to balance out the sweet and sour. And that was it, and just a very simple recipe. But then like it just, that landed and people loved it. So again, like you can have an idea, but you just need to maybe tweak it slightly to your audience. And I think one of the biggest challenges is creating highballs and drinks that need to be replicated and made in all these different countries that we sell Dewars in, which is quite challenging.
I think of just Dewars as Dewars and soda because of my grandmother. Have you been making new products all these years? I mean, what expressions, at least maybe since you've been there, have they created?
So I think the big year for us was definitely 2019. So I joined around 2016, and we'd had a few, we were talking about innovation all the time, and we had all these different ideas. And then, finally we sort of focused on creating something a little bit new and a little bit different. And we wanted to really get something that was super premium, because we didn't have anything, in the sort of really high end age statements. So we wanted to create a range of older whiskeys that had gone through a very specific process using the Dewars heritage and the sort of backstory. So what Dewars is known for as a whiskey is double aging, which is this process of taking all these different whiskeys from around Scotland. So most of our blends, we use up to 40 different single malts, the heart malt of which is Aberfeldy, a beautiful, rich and honeyed single malt. So historically, our first master blender, AJ Cameron, had done this marrying process where he was vatting whiskeys from different regions. So he would take all the really peated whiskeys from Ireland, marry them together to sort of create a bit more unity and cohesion between all the different whiskeys. It's much like cooking, right? Sometimes you make an amazing dish, but it sometimes tastes better after 3 days, sitting in the fridge.
Absolutely.
Because the flavors have had a chance to get to know each other. So Stephanie McLeod, who's our amazing master blender, she took this idea of AJ Cameron's marrying and created a 4-stage aging process. The first of which is maturing your single malt and grain whiskies to the right age statement. And then the second stage is marrying the single malts and marrying the grain whiskey separately. And the third stage is bringing those together and marrying all those whiskies. And the fourth stage is then putting that into different sherry casks. So that's sort of the 4 stages of bringing the whiskey to life. The sherry giving a very unique finish and flavor profile as well. So that's the Dewars Double series, which we launched. And honestly, I think the reaction to the liquid and the whiskey, and even things like the packaging, we've got these beautiful square bottles and the packaging is white. It looks like more like an iPhone case than a whiskey box, It was a really sort of a big step forward for Dewars, and I think really reframed what people thought about blended Scotch, because over the past 60 years since single malts have become really popular, blended scotches tend to be perceived in somewhat of a lesser way, whether it's a price comparison or, the fact that it's not coming from one distillery, but it's blended together in central Scotland. Blends are really important to the world of whiskey. It's like 90% of the export of the Scotch whiskey industry, but also, the way that people think about whiskey, I think, is that, the more rare and unique it is, it's more valuable, and it's, you can go to the distillery and see how it's made. So Double helped us bring focus back to blend, saying actually blended scotches can be really unique and complex and interesting and have all these, different layers going on. So we, this year was pretty amazing because our Double 32, which is our oldest of the three, finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, won the award for, the world's best whiskey at the International Whiskey Competition. So that was pretty amazing.
Yeah. And, I do think I agree with you about the snob value of, single malts. And you can't get better than winning that award. Must have been like, look, guys, you single malt guys, we can do it too. We can do it too.
Yeah. And of course, like, Stephanie, as well as being our master blender for Dewar's, is also our malt master for our 5 single malts as well. So she has such an amazing experience, and she obviously takes that experience from doing both and can interchange experiments with different casks, using her knowledge to create some really amazing whiskeys. So following Double, we launched our 8-year-old cask series because we had almost a gap between Dewar's White Label, which is our, biggest selling blend. We've had that since 1899, and we had our 12-year-old Dewar's. So in between there, we wanted to create an expression which is really appealing to a different audience and recruiting a lot of new whiskey drinkers for the first time with different cask finishes. So we've done the rum cask with Caribbean Smooth. The next one, which is really massive for us, was we actually partnered with Ilegal Mezcal, who are based out in the US, and they gave us some of their Reposado Mezcal casks. So we did the world's first Scotch finished in Mezcal casks.
So does that come out of smoky? I mean, what is the,
It's got
it's kind of a twist on a peaty.
It's not peated like Scotch. So with Mezcal, I think what you get from it, which is really interesting, you don't see a lot in Scotch, is this sort of earthy vegetal sort of note. It's got like notes of like green peppers that have been charred. If you can imagine like a barbecued green pepper, that kind of thing. And there is a subtle sort of smoke that comes through at the end. But that for me is what made it really interesting. And I think that, having a lot of chats with the Ilegal Mezcal team is like, they're trying to, really work to help this perception of Mezcal, not just as like a smoky tequila, but as a really interesting agave spirit and the way it's made, the way it's produced and its uniqueness. So, the great thing about you doing that experiment was getting these Mezcal casks and just seeing for the first time how the Scotch and the Mezcal sort of played off each other. And it's super, super interesting and also amazing for making drinks as well, for making different highballs and cocktails.
I actually like whiskey and a Bloody Mary. So that sounds like it could go really well.
Yeah.
Pepper.
Like going back to the micheladas, might have to try one there. Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
yeah.
exactly.
Well, that's even just having it with a beer on the side, like during the summer I remember when it was really hot, I poured like a little dram of the Ilegal Smooth and had like a little Modelo Mexican beer on the side, that was perfect, just for that day, a little sort of, how we say in Scotland, when we have a beer and a whiskey, we call it a half and half. I think, in the US, traditionally known as a Boilermaker. But beer and whiskey pairings is also an amazing way to explore whiskey's flavors and find some great pairings. And obviously with the highball, we're looking a lot at food pairings at the moment too. So it's a fun time to be working in whiskey. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, well, it sounds like it. And are you allowed to reveal anything that you're doing for the future?
We got obviously more of our 8-year-old cask series coming out very soon. We've got a new one coming out in January in the US. So obviously you'll have to keep your eyes peeled about that. But yeah, obviously that's going to be, a big focus. We've got some amazing innovations coming up, like really excited to showcase them when they land. But, I do think that innovation has really been key for us in helping reframe the opinion of not just obviously Dewar's as a brand, but of Scotch whiskey as well.
Well, I can't wait to come back in January and find out what you're doing.
Absolutely.
So maybe you will come back and tell us.
Absolutely. I will not be going anywhere, especially in the current climate.
No, we're going to forget about that. Yeah. It's all going to change next year, and it's going to be the roaring 20s.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Let's just hope prohibition doesn't come with that.
No. Definitely that. No, it's not going to happen. So then we'll see you then. So thank you so much for being on the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you for having me.
anytime.
You know I couldn't leave Fraser without asking for his top tips for the home bartender and where he would have a drink right now if he could choose anywhere in the world.
I think that a lot of people might be inclined just to go out and buy every spirit and every liqueur and loads of bitters. But I'd be like, look, if you know you have 4 or 5 drinks which you love, just start off with the ingredients for those. Because, even in my kitchen, I've got 20, 25 bottles in the kitchen of different liqueurs and stuff, which, sometimes I don't even use. I just have them just in case, because obviously I do a lot of drinks R&D at home with work. But look, if you love Negronis and you like martinis, and you love, margaritas and, so pick a few gins, pick a few tequilas. And obviously, if you love highballs, hopefully you'll have some Dewars in there as well. But and then pick a few like vermouths and things like sherries and, some other choice liqueurs as well, like Saint Germain elderflower liqueur goes in absolutely everything. Martini vermouth, definitely pick some really nice base spirits. You're going to use some modifiers or liqueurs and some bitters, but don't go crazy. You can always build on top of that collection as you go.
That sounds great. And if you could be drinking anywhere right now, where would that be?
Oh, yeah. I think right at this point in time, especially as the cold weather is kicking in here in London, I would definitely be back at Puerto Rico on the beach drinking my Dewars and coconut out of the coconut shell.
Oh, that sounds good. I could be there too.
Yeah.
I want to thank Fraser for being on the show and Dewars for sponsoring the transcript of this podcast. You can find a link to it on my homepage, alushlifemanual.com. Now, all this talk about Puerto Rico and coconuts has left me thirsty and ready for our cocktail of the week. After describing his coconut highball as tangy, tropical, sweet, and refreshing, I had to have it as our cocktail of the week. Start by adding 50 ml of Dewar's Caribbean Smooth, which is Dewar's finished in ex-rum casks. Yum! Then 20 ml of lemon juice, and finally 20 ml of coconut syrup to a chilled highball glass filled with ice. Then top it up with 100 ml of soda water and stir carefully. Then garnish with a lemon wheel and slapped mint sprig. This cocktail will make you think you have sand between your toes and sun on your face. You'll find this recipe plus more whiskey recipes and all the cocktails of the week at alushlifemanual.com, where you'll find all the ingredients in our shop. So, as I told you, my grandmother would always order a Dewars and soda, while my grandfather always ordered a whiskey sour. Oh, the poor server who would invariably hand her the whiskey sour and my grandfather the scotch and soda. She would rip him apart. If you live for Lush Life, make sure you're giving back to the bars you love by donating or taking part in cocktail delivery where you live. Theme music for Lush Life is by Steven Shapiro and used with permission. And Lush Life is always and will be forever produced by Evo Terra and Simpler Media Productions. Which leaves me to say the wise words of Oscar Wilde, all things in moderation, including moderation. And always drink responsibly and wash your hands and wear a mask. Next week, we meet one of the most famous people in cocktails. I'm not keeping it a secret. It's David Wondrich, the man who wrote Imbibe, Punch, and so much more, as well as being my hero. Until that time, bottoms up.